Hey, welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. This is Jacob Hornberger, and this is my weekly internet show. Nice to be back with y'all. I have just returned from what actually has to be one of the most exciting weeks in the 22-year history of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I mean, last week was our College Civil Liberties Tour. We had an absolute blast sharing ideas on civil liberties and the war on terrorism and the Constitution with 4 different college campuses. It was just absolutely fantastic. So I thought I'd share with you some of our experiences during the past week and talk about why that tour is so important and why the subject of civil liberties, the war on terrorism, and the Constitution is so vitally important, and why the Future of Freedom Foundation has placed such a heavy emphasis on it. Well, the week started out Sunday night with an appearance on Judge Andrew Napolitano's Freedom Watch. They put me there with a segment of the show with me and Lou Rockwell and the judge right there in the studio, and it was just absolutely fantastic, sharing the panel there with Lou, who's been an old friend. And so we had a great time there, and we interacted with a bunch of the staff members and stuff. And then the next day was our first segment of our College Civil Liberties Tour, which we kicked off in New York City at Columbia University. And it was just absolutely fantastic. Now, let me give you a little bit of the background of how this thing got established. Last summer, we were doing a panel. The Future of Freedom Foundation was in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest, and it was Bruce Fine and myself doing the panel, and it was moderated by Jack Hunter, who writes regularly for American Conservative. And the panel went fantastic, and so we ended up leaving there, and Bruce mentions to me, hey, we ought to take this show on to college campuses. And boy, all the light bulbs went off for me, and I said, well, sounds great. And about 3 minutes later, the president of the Young Americans for Liberty, named a guy named Jeff Frazee, he's walking by, and I said, hey, Jeff, what do you think of this idea? And he immediately loved it. And so we decided to enter into this partnership. And now the Young Americans for Liberty is a group nationwide of young college students, or young people, including college students. And they've got chapters in colleges all across the country. So their job was to set up the venue, select the venue, set up the events, reserve the room, and promote it on campus. And then our job was to set up the panel. Now, of course, it was going to be Bruce and me, but I wanted also Glenn Greenwald. Now, what I was trying to do is to set up a cross-ideological panel here so that people could see that this subject of civil liberties transcends ideological differences and different ideologies. Bruce was the conservative on the panel. He served in the Reagan administration in the Justice Department. He was a lawyer. He is a lawyer. And you wouldn't find a greater proponent of the importance of civil liberties and more erudite. I mean, this guy knows everything, and a very, very eloquent proponent of civil liberties that Bruce Fine is. And so I had the conservative, but I wanted a liberal, and there is no greater proponent of civil liberties in the progressive or liberal side than Glenn Greenwald. I mean, I read his blog daily, and I mean, it's fantastic. Forbes magazine had mentioned that Glenn is among the top 25 most influential liberals in the country. And unlike many, many other liberals, Glenn remained steadfast in the defense of civil liberties after Obama came in. As we all know, Obama caved for whatever reason. He abandoned his commitment to civil liberties. He was a constitutional lawyer who had taken the Bush administration to task for what they had done in the area of civil liberties, the tremendous attack on civil liberties that they had committed continuously for 8 years. But as soon as he got into office, for some reason, he just caved. He abandoned all his principles and, kept Guantanamo open, was given immunity to people for, all the war crimes that had been committed, torture and so forth. and looking the other way and promising not to prosecute. I mean, it was just outrageous. And most of the liberals, or at least many of the liberals, just caved along with him. You know, they forgot all their opposition to civil liberties. They said, "Well, if our man is doing this, we've got to support him because he's our man." And they just caved, just like the conservatives and the Republicans caved when Bush took office and leading our country down this horrific dark path. But not Glenn Greenwald. I mean, he remained steadfast in the defense of civil liberties through the whole thing, and has remained steadfast. And much to the chagrin of some of his fellow liberals and progressives who have taken him to task for some of the positions he has taken. So I wanted Glenn on this panel. Glenn had spoken at our 2008 conference on foreign policy and the war on terrorism, and the video of his talk is online at our website at fff.org. So I knew how brilliant this guy was, and I'd read his most recent book, and I wanted him on this panel. So we talked to him, and he lives in Brazil. He was highly enthusiastic about the panel and the subject matter and who we were going to share these ideas with, and so he agreed. So now we had our panel. You know, we had a conservative, Bruce Fine. We had a liberal, Glenn Greenwald, and me, the libertarian. And then moderating it was a conservative libertarian. I put him in both camps, and that's Jack Hunter, who works for both Young Americans for Liberty, and he writes for American Conservative. And I mean, he just made a fantastic moderator because, you know, not only did he, moderate the panel, he was able to give some perspectives himself on the importance of civil liberties and what had gone on in the war on terrorism. So, you know, that sort of sets up the background of this thing. So we show up at Columbia University. We've got a great audience. I forget how many, like 150 people there, mixture of students and non-students. It's just absolutely fantastic. And so, you know, we get going, and you could just feel the energy in this room. I mean, it was just, you could just tell that people were there because they wanted to be there. They were absorbing what was being discussed with them. I mean, I could feel it when I got up to talk. It was just, boy, you could just, as a speaker, you could just feel the energy in the room. And I went first, and then Glenn went second, and Bruce went third. And the videos were being live streamed, and I know they've been recorded. We're going to be organizing them and sharing them with people. And I invite, if you haven't seen them, I invite you to take a look at them. And you might want to look at all four of them because we were just having a blast. Old Glenn, Bruce, and I, that we were discussing, you know, on the plane flights between the cities, you know, the idea of, well, let's modify these things and let's have some fun with this and expand them and have some variations of the topic. So we were shifting as we were going along, and it was fantastic. I mean, because it sort of kept up the energy, and none of us was using any notes, and we were just interacting with the students, and you could feel the energy, and it was just absolutely fantastic. So, you know, we ended up wrapping up the Columbia segment, and we got on early flights the next morning. We flew to Indianapolis. And we had a combined session with the University of Indiana and Purdue University, and that went fantastic too. Again, you could feel the energy going on between the students and the speakers, and it was just awesome. And then the next morning, we get on a flight, and we go to Middle Tennessee State University, which is outside Nashville. That went again fantastic. In the meantime, Bruce gets an invitation to speak at Harvard Law School along with Ralph Nader at noon that day. So he decides to take, in the middle of this whole thing, to take a detour. He gets up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, catches an early flight to Boston, does that luncheon talk, gets on another flight, 2 flights actually, because he couldn't get a nonstop to Nashville. He comes in a little bit late, but plenty of time to get his segment going, and that went fantastic. And then the next night, next morning, we fly over to Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio, And man, I mean that audience just was fantastic too. I mean, it was a great way to wrap up the whole trip. It was just absolutely fantastic, the whole thing. And like I say, we got them all recorded, or at least the students were recording them. So we're gonna figure out how to compile them, put them together, and I would highly invite you to see all four segments. They just went absolutely fantastic, and a big debt of thanks to the Young Americans for Liberty, including those at each college campus, because organizing these things is no easy deal. It takes a lot of work, and everything went smoothly. I mean, I can't tell you how nice it was for the speakers and the moderator to just come into this thing and just present. And that's because of the Young Americans for Liberty. It's a great organization, and it was just such a treat to be working with Glenn Greenwald and Bruce Fine and Jack Hunter. Our program director at FFF, Bart Frazier, he was with us. He was handling all the logistics, the flights, the hotels, everything. Coordinating with the Young Americans for Liberty, how we were going to do transportation. It went absolutely fantastic. Now, why did we do this? Well, you get a sense if you see these programs why we did it. You see, civil liberties, it goes to the heart of what we're fighting for, those of us that are trying to restore freedom in this land. I mean, as libertarians, most of our existence is devoted to talking about socialism, and the out-of-control spending and the debt and so forth. And there's very little attention. I mean, I've been in the libertarian movement, I don't know, 30 years or so now, and there's been very little attention given to the importance of civil liberties. If you go back to our very first year, which is online, our journal, Freedom Daily, we had, in one of our issues, I forget which one, I think it was the July issue, that was, my article was titled "The Vital Importance of Civil Liberties." And the reason that I actually consider this more important than the economic issues. Why is that? Because this area here involves the most totalitarian power of all. The power to just seize people and send them into concentration camps. I mean, you can have all the freedom of speech you want, and freedom of religion, and right to keep and bear arms, fine and good. But if you have relinquished to government the power to just barge into your house with soldiers or CIA agents or FBI agents or the local police and grab you, and without charging you with a crime, no warrant, and cart you to a concentration camp or to a military dungeon where they can torture you, they can do all sorts of bad things to you, execute you, then you can have all those other freedoms in the world. They're not going to do you any bit of good. In fact, once you understand that government's got this power over you, where it can just go out and seize you and cart you away, that's inevitably going to affect your freedom of speech and your other freedoms, you see, because you're going to factor that in. You're going to behave in order that the government doesn't exercise this ultimate totalitarian power. And this is why this thing has been so important. Conservatives don't get this at all. I guarantee you conservatives don't get it at all. Well, with the exception of people like Bruce Fine. I'm not saying all conservatives don't get it, but it's a very, very small percentage. They don't understand that the power that's involved in this totalitarian power, or they think it's beneficial. They think it's freedom when the government has its power, because all they think in terms of is, oh, well, I'm going to be kept safe. I'm going to be kept safe. And so they're willing to trade this totalitarian power because the government's saying, hey, look, if you just give us this power, we'll focus only on the bad guys and we're going to keep you safe. Well, throughout history, we've learned that that's just a sham. That's just a fake. That you end up losing your freedom because there's no way to reconcile a free society with that kind of power. It's just impossible. That when the government's got the power to just take you off the street and cart you away to a concentration camp or send a platoon of soldiers at your house and bash down your door, that's even better than a SWAT team in the drug war and so forth. Well, that's the ultimate power. And to get a sense of whether this is, reconcilable with a free society, you can go to places like Egypt. I mean, the Egyptian government's got the same power that the U.S. government now has, the power to just go arrest people, cart them away to a military prison, dungeon, what have you, torture them. I mean, don't forget that the U.S. government partnered with the Egyptian regime to torture this guy Mahar Arar that they took into custody at Dulles Airport. The guy was just changing planes. He was returning home to Canada. He's a Canadian citizen, and they took him into custody and they said, "You're a terrorist." But instead of taking him to a judge and charging him with some act of terrorism, they couldn't extract a confession out of him, so they just renditioned him to Egypt. Now you say, well, how did they do that? How did they negotiate the deal for the rendition and the torture? They tortured the guy for a year, okay? An entire year. And, well, we don't know because it's national security, you see. They say, well, national security precludes us from telling you how we got this done. But no one denies that Egypt is a brutal military dictatorship. It's a military dictatorship that the U.S. government loves, the Pentagon loves. Oh, yeah, they may be trying to make it look like they don't love them now because they're not real popular, but they've loved them for 30 years. It's their model society. The Egyptian military keeps people safe. It maintains order and stability. It tortures the bad guys. It's their model. And that's why they've been funneling billions of dollars of armaments and cash for this military regime, because the military in Egypt takes the position that it is the foundation of society. And right now it's taking that position. People are trying to establish a new government, a democratic government. The military says, we are the foundation. We stay here. You build your society on top of this foundation. Well, the U.S. officials take that same position. The national military and the military-industrial complex in the United States, the CIA, the national security state, that's the foundation of society in their mind, and then everything grows out of that. And part of that is supporting military dictatorships like in Egypt, because the military is the foundation of society along with their CIA and so forth. I mean, take a look at this situation in Syria. You see the U.S., introducing a resolution condemning the Assad dictatorship and so forth. Well, they're not really condemning the dictatorship, they're condemning the dictator. They want to put in a new dictator, so that one that'll be more responsive to the U.S. And how do we know this? Well, guess what? In Syria, they used that dictatorship for torture too. As a matter of fact, I realized I just made a mistake. Mahar Arar they renditioned to Syria. The guy that they renditioned to Egypt was the guy that they kidnapped in Italy and then took to Egypt. Now you say, how did they strike this deal with the Syrian dictatorship that they now purport to condemn? I don't know. They won't talk. They say it's national security, whatever that term means. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a way to disguise what they're doing. But the CIA agents who kidnapped that guy in Italy, they were all convicted of felonies. Now, that's not to say they went back to defend themselves. They skedaddled out of that country, and they're not ever going to return to Italy again. The U.S. is not going to extradite them. They're convicted felons. We don't even know where they are. I mean, they're in hiding. Imagine that. I mean, it shows you how these people have warped our values, warped our country, extolling dictatorships and now acting like they're against the dictatorships. I mean, and this has been going on a long time. I mean, in fact, their model dictatorship undoubtedly is the Chilean dictatorship under Pinochet that they helped bring into power, including by murdering at least one American, maybe two. That was, of course, Charles Horman, a young 25-year-old or so journalist, American, that the CIA helped murder. Now, what role did the CIA play? We don't know. You see, it's national security. They don't talk. Nobody's going to make them talk because they're the CIA. They're the foundation of society. They're the bedrock, at least in their mind. And as a reality of how our country is now formulated, they don't have to talk. Nobody can force them to talk. Not the Congress, not the executive branch, the judiciary. That they have never disclosed what role they played in Horman's murder. And those that say, oh, well, the CIA would never kill an American. Well, they did, They killed Horman. But their model was Pinochet, because Pinochet was torturing people, and and of course Pinochet's mind, the CIA's mind, he was only torturing bad guys, bad guys, and of course they define what a bad guy is, and they were raping people, they were killing them, dumping them over the ocean alive. It was just horrendous, absolutely. But in their mind, this was the model. This is the model because Pinochet was pro-free market. You see, and that was their whole idea: is that, we got to stop socialism. But they didn't understand that by adopting these methods, they were adopting the tactics, the methods of the communists. So in order to fight the Cold War, they were, turning our country into a country whose government was adopting communist methods. And they never saw that. They said, oh, well, as long as we got an American flag on our sleeves and we're anti-communist, then it's all pro-freedom. And, of course, libertarians were opposing this. And then later, they just simply changed the term communism to terrorism, and they're doing the same thing. They're warping our values. They're warping everything this country has stood for. And they taking away people's freedom. I mean, that's as we were emphasizing in this panel, we now live in a country which is no different in principle from the Egyptian military dictatorship, in the sense that the military can now arrest any American and cart him away to a military dungeon, a concentration camp. And people say, oh, well, they would never do that. Well, they did in World War II. They rounded up Japanese Americans. They took them into concentration camps. World War I, they were rounding up dissidents. During the Vietnam War, they were spying on anti-war groups, monitoring their activities, doing their best to destroy them. I mean, they get paranoid. These people get paranoid in the national security state. And the problem is that their definition of enemy combatant as a threat to national security inevitably expands, where they look at dissidents as, a fifth columnist, boy, they're sympathizing with the enemy. Oh, they're trying to, join up with the other side. They don't see critics of government as simply people that are trying to restore freedom to our land, restore the founding principles of a constitutional republic. And we now, we live in a country where the president can just assassinate anybody he wants. I mean, including Americans. In the beginning, when they set up that camp after 9/11 at Guantanamo Bay, a lot of Americans cheered and said, oh, that's just going to be for foreigners. That's just going to be for foreigners. And we kept saying at the Future of Freedom Foundation, don't be so naive. They will inevitably expand this power to include Americans, and it was just logical. Because anybody can be a terrorist. Anybody can be a threat to national security. And in fact, an American threat to national security is much more serious than a foreign threat because he's here. And so, inevitably, they were going to expand this thing. And remember, they were saying the war on terrorism is global. The entire world is a battlefield. And, hey, that means the United States is part of this battlefield. And what's really interesting is their position was that only the U.S. government can wage the war on terrorism, and selected allies, that needed to maintain order and stability and keep the people safe. That if you weren't part of that alliance, the imperial worldwide alliance, then you weren't permitted to wage the war on terrorism. I mean, like take Venezuela, for example. It's not part of the worldwide alliance. And so, it's been trying to extradite the man that it accuses of downing this Cuban airliner that killed, 50 to 100 people, including the members of Cuba's fencing team. All civilians. It was a civilian airliner. And the U.S. has been harboring him over here. They won't extradite him to Venezuela. But Venezuela, do you suppose they sent drones over the United States and started bombing areas where they thought this guy was? His name is Luis Posada Carriles. Or suppose they sent an army in here and attacked to capture this guy and take him back? Well, the U.S. would consider that an act of war. Because, you see, Venezuela's not part of the alliance. But if the U.S. goes into Italy, kidnaps a guy there, CIA agents, paramilitary, and extradite him, or rendition him to Egypt or to Syria or to Libya. Libya's another military dictatorship that they were getting to torture people. Then all that's considered okay. But, assassinate, sure. U.S. government's now got the power to assassinate, including right here on American soil, because it's all part of the battlefield. Well, what greater power could you have than that? I mean, you see, that's what the whole Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments were all about. Now, libertarians, especially to a lesser extent conservatives, talk about fundamental rights and pre-existing rights and God-given rights, but basically they're talking about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, economic liberty, the right to keep and bear arms. But it's been inculcated in us for decades that the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments, right to counsel, right to a grand jury indictment, uh, right to confront witnesses, right to trial by jury, are like constitutional technicalities, especially in the drug war, to let people go free. And those are just things that criminal defense lawyers use to let the guilty go free. And I mean, we've been taught, that to condemn these things. Well, actually, our American ancestors, the framers, the founding fathers, they understood why there's four amendments. Now, notice these are not God-given rights. Due process of law and trial by jury. There's not a fundamental right. These rights have arisen over centuries in resistance to this particular power, the power to seize people and take them into custody and cart them away, torture them, kill them. It goes all the way back to Magna Carta. That phrase, due process of law, goes all the way back to Magna Carta, where the King of England finally relinquished, conceded that he no longer had the power to take people into custody in violation of the law of the land. And that phrase, law of the land, evolved in the due process of law. And our ancestors understood that. That's why there's four amendments confronting this direct power to take people into custody, cart them away, assassinate them. But U.S. officials figured out a way. After centuries, post 9/11, everybody was afraid, or not everybody, but most, a lot of people were afraid. People's knees were knocking. And, government, do whatever you think's necessary. And relinquishing this power that gave them, for the first time in 800 years, a way to circumvent the protections of those four amendments. Now, they have the option. They can send suspected terrorists in the federal court system, or they can send them into the unconstitutional system, the extrajudicial system, the Pentagon system. But, if you have the option, then effectively game's over. I mean, if you can assassinate people without providing any explanation, any judicial interference, game's over. I mean, the government now has omnipotent power. And this is not the kind of country that we were founded upon. I mean, do you really think that Madison and Jefferson and Franklin wanted this kind of power? You think George Washington wanted a country where the government has this kind of power? Of course not. And of course, it's all because of the U.S. government's foreign policy. They've gone over there. They've stirred up all these hornets' nests. They kill people. They invade people. They sanction people. They embargo people. They kidnap, assassinate, invade, occupy, and then they say, oh, the terrorists are coming to get us. Not because of all these things we've done, not because we've bombed their wedding parties or killed their people or, sexually abused people in the prisons and raped and whatever. No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It all has to do with the fact they hate our freedom and values. Yeah, right. And so they use that as excuse. I mean, I say it's the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history. The longer they invade, the longer they occupy and do all these things, sanctions, embargoes, then the greater chance that you have this continuous terrorist threat, because people get angry over that, and then you use the terrorist threat to say, well, temporarily, now we have to have the power to seize people, to assassinate people. Oh, but don't worry, we'll never exercise it against you. Well, okay, they may not be exercising it over large numbers of Americans, but all you need is one great big crisis. And we all know that the test of a free society is not the extent to which they're wielding totalitarian-like powers, it's whether they even have the power at all. And only a free society is one in which they don't even have the power to do these things. I mean, like the power to regulate religion. We don't judge a free society by the fact that they're not regulating that many churches. We measure it by the fact they don't even have the power to regulate churches. And this is what we've got to restore in this country. A society where they don't even have these powers. That's the only true society. And so that's why we keep focusing on civil liberties. We're going to continue doing so, because even if we restore, economic liberty, which we need to do, of course we need to do that, that doesn't do anything as long as they still have this other power, the direct power, the power that goes all the way back to Magna Carta, where the English people succeeded in getting eliminated. So that's the show tonight. Great to be back with you, and thank you very much. And I'll see you all next week. So long.